The wagon wheels groaned against the rutted trail as Clara Hensley guided her two exhausted mules toward the cluster of buildings that made up Ridgeback Creek. It was late September of 1886, and the Montana sky stretched above her in that particular shade of pale blue that seemed to promise nothing and everything at once. She had been traveling for 6 weeks, first by train to Helena, then by wagon through territory that grew wilder and more silent with each passing mile. Her hands, already rough from years of work, had developed new calluses from gripping the reins, and her back ached in places she had forgotten existed. The settlement was smaller than she had imagined from her husband's letters. A general store with a false front stood at the center, its paint peeling in long strips that curled like dead skin. Beside it sat a blacksmith's forge, the ring of hammer on iron echoing across the valley. A saloon occupied the corner, its windows dark even in daylight, and a scattering of other buildings completed the picture of a town that existed more out of stubbornness than prosperity. Beyond the main street, she could see homesteads dotting the valley floor and climbing the lower slopes of the mountains, their cabins trailing thin ribbons of smoke into the autumn air. Clara pulled her wagon to a stop in front of the general store and climbed down, her joints protesting after hours on the hard wooden seat. She was 28 years old, though the past year had aged her in ways that did not show on her face. Her husband William had died of consumption in the spring, coughing his life away in a Minnesota boarding house while she held his hand and watched the light leave his eyes. They had been married for 3 years, and in that time he had filed a homestead claim in Montana territory, dreaming of the day they would build a life together on land that belonged to no one but themselves. The consumption had stolen that dream from him, but Clara had decided it would not steal it from her. She straightened her traveling dress, brushed the dust from her sleeves, and walked into the general store. The interior was dim and smelled of leather, tobacco, and the sharp tang of kerosene. A man stood behind the counter, his face weathered by decades of wind and sun, his eyes sharp beneath bushy grey eyebrows. He looked up as she entered, and his expression shifted from mild curiosity to something closer to surprise. "I am looking for the land office," Clara said. "I have papers for a homestead claim." The man studied her for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she was lost or simply confused. "The land office is in Helena," he said finally, "but if you have filed papers, you can register your arrival with the territorial agent. That would be Horace Whitfield. He keeps an office above the saloon." Clara thanked him and turned to leave, but the man's voice stopped her. "You are here alone?" She faced him again. "I am." He shook his head slowly, and something that might have been pity crossed his features. "The Hensley claim," he said. "I remember your husband coming through here 2 years back. He was a good man, had plans." "He did," Clara agreed. The storekeeper leaned forward on the counter. "Ma'am, I do not mean any disrespect, but that land has sat empty since your husband filed on it. The cabin he started is nothing but a foundation and some rotted logs. Winter comes early here and stays late. You would be better served selling your claim and heading back east." Clara met his gaze without flinching. "I appreciate your concern," she said, "but I did not travel 6 weeks to turn around at the first discouragement." She left him standing behind his counter and walked out into the pale sunlight. The territorial agent, Horace Whitfield, was a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers who seemed genuinely surprised to see her. He shuffled through his papers, confirmed that the Hensley claim was still valid, and recorded her arrival in a leather-bound ledger. When she asked about the condition of the land, he described it with the detached efficiency of a man who had seen many dreamers come and go. 160 acres, he said. Good water from a spring that runs year-round. Some timber on the north slope. Your husband chose well in that regard. The foundation he started is still there, though you will need to rebuild from the ground up." He paused and looked at her over his spectacles. "Mrs. Hensley, I am required to inform you that you must show improvements within 5 years to prove up your claim. That means a dwelling, cultivated land, and continuous residence. Do you understand what that entails?" "I understand," Clara said. He nodded slowly. "There is a family nearby, the Dawsons. Ezra Dawson has the spread to the south of your claim. He has offered in the past to purchase abandoned homesteads. If you find the work too difficult, he might be willing to make you an offer." Clara signed the papers he placed before her and thanked him for his time. She did not mention that she had no intention of selling anything to anyone. The ride to her land took most of the afternoon. The trail wound through a valley that narrowed as it climbed toward the mountains, passing homesteads that grew increasingly sparse. She saw cattle grazing on brown autumn grass, their breath steaming in the cooling air. She saw children watching her wagon pass, their faces dirty and curious. She saw women hanging laundry and men splitting wood, all of them pausing to observe the stranger in their midst. Her land, when she finally reached it, was everything William had described in his letters and nothing like she had imagined. The valley opened into a natural bowl, sheltered by a ridge of rock to the north, the stone rising in a sheer face that would block the worst of the winter winds. Hay Stream ran through the eastern portion of the property, its water clear and cold when she knelt to drink from it. The timber her husband had mentioned stood in a thick grove of pine and spruce, the trees tall and straight and perfect for building. The foundation he had started was exactly as the territorial agent had described, a rectangular outline of stacked stones, the logs that had once rested upon them now rotted and useless. Clara walked the perimeter slowly, trying to imagine the cabin William had envisioned. It would have faced south, catching the winter sun. It would have had a view of the valley below. She made camp that night beside the ruined foundation, cooking beans and salt pork over a small fire while the stars emerged in their thousands above her. The silence was immense, broken only by the crackle of flames and the distant call of an owl. She thought about William and the dreams they had shared. She thought about the life she had left behind in Minnesota. She thought about the doubt she had seen in the storekeeper's eyes and the territorial agent's careful warnings. Then she lay down in her bedroll and slept more soundly than she had in months. The work began the following morning and did not stop for weeks. Clara had grown up on a farm in Minnesota, the daughter of a Norwegian immigrant who had carved his homestead from wilderness and raised 7 children on land that tried to kill them every winter. Her father had taught her to build, to plan, to think in terms of survival rather than comfort. Those lessons came back to her now as she surveyed her land and began to make decisions that would determine whether she lived or died. The first thing she did was walk every acre of her property, studying the terrain with the careful eye her father had trained. She noted how the wind moved through the valley, where the snow would drift deepest, how the sun tracked across the sky. She found the spot where her cabin would stand, not on the open ground where William had started his foundation, but tucked against the base of the rock ridge, where the stone would provide shelter from the north wind and reflect heat back toward her walls. When she rode into Ridgeback Creek to purchase supplies, the storekeeper looked at her with renewed surprise. "You are still here," he observed. "I am still here," she agreed. "I need lumber, nails, and sawdust. As much sawdust as you can find." He blinked at her. "Sawdust? For insulation," she explained. "I am building double walls." The storekeeper, whose name she learned was Harold Peck, shook his head slowly. "I have been in this territory for 15 years, Mrs. Hensley. I have never seen anyone build double walls. The weight alone would be considerable." Clara smiled slightly. "My father built double walls in Minnesota. Our cabin stood through winters that killed half the livestock in the county." Word of her unusual construction methods spread through the settlement with the speed of wildfire. Within days, Clara found herself the subject of curiosity, skepticism, and open ridicule. The neighboring homesteaders rode past her property to watch her work, shaking their heads at the strange woman who dug her foundation twice as deep as necessary and hauled stones from the creek bed to line a root cellar that seemed absurdly large. The sharpest criticism came from Ezra Dawson, who owned the largest spread in the valley and carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never been wrong about anything. He was in his 50s, broad-shouldered and prosperous, with 3 grown sons who worked his land and a wife who rarely left their comfortable ranch house. He rode up to Clara's property on a grey afternoon in early October, accompanied by his eldest son, Jacob, and sat his horse while watching her notch logs with an axe. "Mrs. Hensley," he said, his voice carrying the tone of a man addressing a particularly slow child. "I heard you were building something unusual up here. I had to see it for myself." "Clara did not stop working, Mr. Dawson," she acknowledged. He gestured toward the partially completed walls, the gap between the inner and outer layers clearly visible. "What exactly is the purpose of this construction?" "Insulation," Clara said. "The gap will be filled with sawdust and dried moss. It will hold heat better than a single wall." Dawson exchanged a glance with his son, and both men smiled in a way that made Clara's jaw tighten. "My father built homes in this valley before you were born, Mrs. Hensley. He never needed double walls or sawdust or any of this Norwegian nonsense. A good cabin with tight joints and a proper stove is all anyone needs." Clara set down her axe and faced him directly. "Your father's methods may have served him well. I prefer my own." Dawson's smile faded slightly. "I came here to offer you a fair price for your claim," he said. $500. That is more than the land is worth, but I am a charitable man. You could return to Minnesota and live comfortably for several years on that sum. My claim is not for sale," Clara said. Dawson studied her for a long moment, his expression shifting from condescension to something harder. "Suit yourself," he said finally. "But when the snow comes and you find yourself freezing in that foolish contraption, do not come begging at my door." He turned his horse and rode away, his son following behind, and Clara watched them go with her hands clenched at her sides. The incident with Dawson set the tone for her interactions with the other settlers. They were not cruel exactly, but neither were they welcoming. They watched her from a distance and whispered among themselves, and when she came to town for supplies, conversations would fall silent as she passed. She heard the words they used to describe her: foolish, stubborn, that foreign woman with her strange ideas. She learned to ignore them and focus on her work. By mid-October, the walls of her cabin were rising steadily. Clara worked from dawn until dark, her muscles aching and her hands blistered, but the progress was undeniable. The double-wall construction was more labor-intensive than traditional building, but she had planned carefully and worked efficiently. She cut logs from her own timber, hauled them to the building site with her mules, and notched them with the precision her father had taught her. The inner wall went up first, then the outer wall with its carefully measured gap. Then the long process of filling that gap with sawdust and moss she gathered from the forest floor. Her roof was the next subject of ridicule. She built it steep, far steeper than the low-pitched roofs favored by other settlers, with heavy rafters designed to bear the weight of deep snow. When Harold Peck asked her about it during one of her supply runs, she explained that a steep roof would shed snow rather than collecting it, reducing the risk of collapse. The storekeeper nodded thoughtfully. "That makes a kind of sense," he admitted. "But it will take twice the lumber." "I have timber to spare," Clara said. It was during one of these supply runs that she first encountered Thomas Crow Feather. He was standing outside the general store when she emerged, a tall man with dark hair that hung past his shoulders and features that spoke of mixed heritage. His clothing was a blend of frontier practicality and indigenous craftsmanship. A leather coat decorated with subtle beadwork, worn trousers tucked into moccasin-style boots. He carried himself with the quiet alertness of someone accustomed to being watched and judged, and when his eyes met Clara's, she saw in them a wary intelligence that immediately commanded her respect. "You are the woman building the strange cabin," he said. It was not a question. "I am," Clara replied. "And you are the trader they speak of, Thomas Crow Feather." Something flickered in his expression, surprise perhaps that she knew his name and used it without hesitation. "I trade between the settlement and the Blackfoot camps to the north," he confirmed. "Furs mostly, sometimes horses." Clara nodded. She had heard of him from Harold Peck, who had mentioned in passing that a half-breed trader came through every few weeks and that most of the settlers avoided doing business with him despite the quality of his goods. "I may need furs before winter," she said. "Blankets too, if you have them." Thomas studied her with an intensity that might have been unsettling if Clara had been easily unsettled. "I have heard about your cabin," he said. "The double walls, the steep roof, the position against the rock ridge." "Word travels fast," Clara observed. "In a valley this small, everything travels fast." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more serious. "The elders in the Blackfoot camps are talking about the winter to come. They say the signs point to cold like none of us have seen. The animals are behaving strangely. The birds left early. The elk are moving to lower ground already." Clara felt something tighten in her chest. "I have heard similar things," she admitted. "The old-timers in Minnesota used to read signs like that." Thomas nodded slowly. "Your cabin may be wiser than people think," he said. "I hope you're building it strong enough." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect and walked away, leaving Clara standing in the dusty street with his words echoing in her mind. That night, she worked until her lantern ran out of oil, and when she finally collapsed into her bedroll, she dreamed of snow falling in sheets so thick she could not see her hand in front of her face. The first snow came in early November, a light dusting that melted by midday, but served as a warning of what lay ahead. Clara stood in the doorway of her nearly completed cabin and watched the flakes drift down from a sky the color of old pewter, and she felt the familiar tightening in her chest that always accompanied the changing of seasons. In Minnesota, her father had called this feeling the winter knowing, that instinct bred into people who lived in hard country, the awareness that the easy days were ending and the time of survival was beginning. Her cabin was not finished, but it was close. The walls stood solid and true, the double construction creating a structure that looked almost fortress-like compared to the single-wall cabins scattered across the valley. The roof was complete, its steep pitch already proving its worth as the snow slid off in sheets rather than accumulating. She had installed the heavy iron stove she had purchased in Helena, its chimney rising through the roof at an angle designed to prevent downdrafts. The floor was packed earth covered with sawdust, not ideal but adequate until she could afford proper boards. What remained was the detail work that would make the difference between comfort and mere survival. She needed to chink every gap in the walls with a mixture of mud and moss. She needed to hang the heavy blankets Thomas Crow Feather had sold her over the windows and door to provide additional insulation. She needed to finish the root cellar and stock it with enough provisions to last until spring. She needed to build a proper shelter for her mules and lay in enough hay to feed them through the cold months. The list seemed endless, and the days were growing shorter. Thomas had come by twice since their first meeting, each time bringing supplies she had requested, and staying to observe her progress with that quiet intensity she was beginning to recognize as his way. He said little, but what he said mattered. He pointed out a gap in her chimney flashing that would have let in moisture. He suggested she angle her woodpile to shed snow more effectively. He brought her a bundle of dried herbs the Blackfoot used to treat frostbite and explained how to prepare them. On his third visit, in the second week of November, he arrived leading a pack horse loaded with furs and stayed longer than usual. "You are nearly ready," he observed, walking the perimeter of her cabin with his hands clasped behind his back. "Nearly," Clara agreed. "Another week of good weather, and I will be as prepared as I can be." Thomas stopped and looked toward the north where the mountains rose in jagged peaks already white with snow. "The weather will not hold another week," he said. 3 days, perhaps 4. Then the first real storm will come. Clara followed his gaze. "How can you know that?" He was quiet for a moment before answering. "My mother was Blackfoot," he said. "She taught me to read the land the way your father taught you to build. The clouds have a certain weight to them when a storm is gathering. The animals behave differently. The air itself changes." Clara nodded slowly. She had noticed some of what he described, the unusual stillness in the forest, the way her mules had grown restless and difficult. "Will you be safe?" she asked. "When the storms come?" Thomas turned to look at her, and something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "I have a cabin in the foothills," he said. "It is small but solid. I built it myself in the way my mother's people taught me." "The way your mother's people taught you," Clara repeated. "Is that different from the way the settlers build?" Thomas smiled slightly, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. "Different enough that they would laugh at it," he said, "just as they laugh at yours." There was a shared understanding in that moment, a recognition of kinship between two people who had both chosen paths that others found foolish. Clara felt something ease in her chest, some tension she had not realized she was carrying. "Would you like coffee?" she asked. "It is not much, but I have a pot ready." Thomas hesitated, and she understood his hesitation. A Métis man taking coffee in a white woman's cabin would set tongues wagging throughout the valley. The settlers already viewed her with suspicion, and they viewed him with something closer to hostility. "I would," he said finally. "Thank you." They sat on wooden crates in her cabin, drinking bitter coffee from tin cups while the fire crackled in the stove. And Thomas told her about the winter the Blackfoot elders were predicting. He spoke of the signs they had observed, the patterns in nature that pointed to cold of extraordinary severity. He told her about the winter of 1856, when he had been a boy of 7, and the snow had buried entire villages, and the cold had killed more people than all the wars of that decade combined. "My grandfather survived that winter," he said. "He told me stories that I thought were exaggerations, until I grew old enough to understand that the land does not exaggerate. When it decides to kill, it kills without mercy and without hesitation." Clara listened in silence, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup for warmth. "The settlers in this valley have not seen a winter like that," Thomas continued. "They think they understand cold because they have endured a few hard months, but there is a difference between cold that makes you uncomfortable and cold that stops your heart between one breath and the next. And you believe this winter will be that kind of cold?" Thomas met her eyes. "I believe the signs point to something we have not seen in 30 years. I believe many people in this valley are not prepared, and I believe you may be one of the few who survives what is coming." The weight of his words settled over Clara like a physical thing. She thought about the Dawson family in their large but conventional cabin, about the other homesteaders scattered across the valley with their single-wall construction and their low-pitched roofs. She thought about the children she had seen watching her wagon pass on her first day in the settlement. "Should we warn them?" she asked. Thomas laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "I have warned them," he said. "Every time I come to trade, I tell them what the elders say. They smile and nod and ignore every word. To them I am just a half-breed who talks too much." Clara set down her coffee cup. "And if you are right, if the cold comes as you predict, then many of them will die," Thomas said simply, "and there is nothing I can do to stop it." He left shortly after, promising to return before the first major storm with additional supplies she might need. Clara stood in the doorway of her cabin and watched him ride away, his figure growing smaller against the vastness of the valley until he disappeared around a bend in the trail. That evening, she worked until her hands bled, chinking gaps and reinforcing weak points with a desperation that bordered on frenzy. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and relentless labor. Clara rose before dawn and worked until full dark, pausing only to eat and tend to her animals. She completed the chinking on her walls, hung the blankets Thomas had brought over every opening, and finished her root cellar. She hauled load after load of firewood from her timber grove, stacking it against the south wall of her cabin where it would stay driest. She built a crude but functional shelter for her mules, banking it with earth and straw until it resembled a small hill more than a building. On the third day, as Thomas had predicted, the clouds gathered along the northern horizon with a weight and darkness that made Clara's stomach clench. By noon, the first flakes were falling. By evening, the snow was coming down in sheets so thick she could barely see her woodpile from the cabin door. The storm lasted 2 days. Clara huddled in her cabin, feeding the stove and listening to the wind howl around her walls, and she felt a fierce satisfaction as her double-wall construction proved its worth. The interior stayed warm, even as the temperature outside plummeted. The steep roof shed snow in regular avalanches that thundered past her windows. The position against the rock ridge sheltered her from the worst of the wind. When the storm finally broke, she emerged into a world transformed. The snow lay 3 feet deep across the valley, drifting to twice that height in places. The sky had cleared to a brilliant, merciless blue, and the cold bit at her exposed skin with teeth that seemed determined to draw blood. She spent the day digging out her woodpile and checking on her mules, who had survived the storm in their earthen shelter with apparent comfort. The hay she had stored was holding up well, and the spring that fed her property was still running beneath its covering of ice. She was, she realized with something approaching wonder, in better shape than she had any right to expect. Her satisfaction was short-lived. On the second day after the storm, visitors began arriving at her property, and they did not come with congratulations. The first was Jacob Dawson, Ezra's eldest son, who rode up on a horse that looked half frozen and regarded Clara's cabin with an expression of frank disbelief. The roof held, he said, as if he had expected to find her buried under collapsed timbers. The roof held, Clara confirmed. Jacob rode a slow circle around her cabin, taking in the double walls, the steep pitch of the roof, the sheltered position against the rock ridge. "His father sent me to check on you," he said, though something in his tone suggested this was not entirely true. He was concerned you might need assistance. Clara crossed her arms against the cold. "As you can see, I am managing." Jacob nodded slowly, but he did not leave. "That was a hard storm," he said. "We lost a section of fence and 2 head of cattle that wandered into a drift. The Hendricks place up the valley, their roof collapsed." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Was anyone hurt?" "The family got out in time. They are staying with the Muellers until they can rebuild." Clara absorbed this information in silence. The Hendricks had a young family, she remembered, 3 children under the age of 10. She tried to imagine what it must have been like for them, huddled in their cabin as the roof gave way, scrambling through the darkness and the snow with children screaming in terror. "That was only the first storm," Jacob said, and now there was no mistaking the worry beneath his arrogant facade. "The old-timers say we have not seen anything yet." He left without another word, and Clara watched him go with a growing sense of unease. Over the days that followed, a strange thing began to happen. The settlers who had mocked Clara's construction methods started finding reasons to ride past her property. They would pause at the edge of her land, studying her cabin with expressions that ranged from curiosity to something approaching envy. Some of them even stopped to ask questions about her techniques, though they phrased their inquiries in ways that allowed them to maintain their dignity. "That gap between your walls," Harold Peck said during one of her supply runs. "How wide is it exactly?" 6 inches, Clara told him. "And you filled it with sawdust?" "Sawdust and dried moss. The moss helps prevent the sawdust from settling." Peck nodded thoughtfully, and Clara could see him filing the information away for future reference. The only settler who seemed genuinely pleased by Clara's success was a woman named Martha Reeves, who ran the valley's small schoolhouse and lived in a cramped cabin at the edge of town. She was a widow like Clara, though older by 20 years, and she had watched Clara's arrival and subsequent labors with quiet interest. "They say you built your cabin the Norwegian way," Martha said when she came to visit one grey afternoon. "My grandmother was from Sweden. She used to talk about the old country, how they built houses to survive winters that would kill a Texan stone dead." Clara smiled, perhaps the first genuine smile she had offered anyone in the settlement. "My father was born in Bergen," she said. "He always said that anyone could build a house that looked pretty. The trick was building one that kept you alive." Martha laughed, a warm sound that seemed out of place in the frozen landscape. "I like you, Mrs. Hensley. You have sense, which is more than I can say for most of the men in this valley." They talked for an hour, sharing coffee and stories, and when Martha left, Clara felt something she had not experienced since arriving in Montana territory. She felt like she might have found a friend. The second storm came in late November, worse than the first. The temperature dropped so low that Clara's water bucket froze solid in the time it took her to walk from the spring to her cabin. The wind screamed down from the mountains with a ferocity that seemed almost personal, as if the land itself had decided to test her resolve. She stayed inside for 3 days, venturing out only to feed her mules and gather more wood, and each time she opened her door, the cold hit her like a physical blow. When the storm passed, Thomas Crow Feather appeared at her door with frost in his hair and a grim expression on his weathered face. "The Blackfoot camps have moved south," he said without preamble. "They are going to the winter grounds early. The elders say this is only the beginning." Clara invited him inside, and he stood by her stove with his hands extended toward the heat, his body slowly thawing. "How bad?" Clara asked. Thomas was silent for a long moment. "I spoke with an elder named Running Wolf," he said finally. "He is 93 winters old. He remembers the killing cold of 1856. He says the signs this year are worse." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "Worse?" "The animals know," Thomas said. "The deer have disappeared from the high country. The wolves are moving in packs larger than anyone has seen. Even the ravens have gone quiet." He turned to look at her, and his dark eyes were filled with something that might have been fear. "Running Wolf says we should prepare for cold that will freeze a man's breath in his lungs. Cold that will kill livestock where they stand. Cold that will test every cabin in this valley and find most of them wanting." Clara thought about the Hendricks family, already displaced by a collapsed roof. She thought about the other homesteaders with their single-wall cabins and their stubborn certainty that they understood winter. She thought about the children she had seen playing in the snow after the first storm, their cheeks red with cold, and their laughter ringing across the valley. "What should I do?" she asked. Thomas looked around her cabin, taking in the double walls, the well-stocked woodpile visible through the window, the carefully sealed gaps and the heavy blankets over every opening. "You have already done more than most," he said. "But if I were you, I would prepare for visitors. When the killing cold comes, this cabin may be the only refuge in the valley." Clara shook her head. "There is not enough room," she said. "I have supplies for one person, maybe two. I cannot feed an entire settlement." Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I have been trading for months," he said. "I have credit with Harold Peck and with the merchants in Helena." He handed her the paper, and she saw it was a list of supplies, flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, and dozens of other items. "I can have these delivered within the week, if you will accept them." Clara stared at the list, then at Thomas. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "Because I know what it is like to be alone," he said. "Because I know what it is like to have people look at you like you do not belong. And because I believe you are the kind of person who will do the right thing when the time comes, even if it costs you everything." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, and she blinked them back with fierce determination. She took the paper from his hand and folded it carefully. "I will accept your supplies," she said, "but I want you to promise me something. Name it. When the killing cold comes, I want you here. I want you safe." Thomas smiled, that rare expression that transformed his weathered face. "I promise," he said. "When the killing cold comes, I will be here." He left that afternoon, riding north toward the Blackfoot camps to complete his trading before the worst of winter set in. Clara watched him go, and she felt something stir in her chest that she had not felt since William died, something warm and terrifying and entirely unexpected. She pushed the feeling aside and turned back to her preparations. There was work to be done, and the cold was coming. December arrived with a cold that seemed to have weight and substance, pressing down on the valley like a physical force. Clara woke each morning to find frost patterns on the inside of her windows, intricate crystals that caught the weak winter light and sparkled like scattered diamonds. She would lie in her bed for a moment, watching her breath fog in the air, before forcing herself to rise and feed the stove that had become the beating heart of her existence. The supplies Thomas had promised arrived on the 3rd day of December, brought by a freight wagon from Helena that barely made it through the snow-choked passes. The driver, a grizzled man named Hank Morrison, who had been hauling goods through Montana Territory for 20 years, looked at Clara's cabin with undisguised amazement. "I have seen a lot of homesteads in my time," he said, as he unloaded crates and barrels onto her porch. "Never seen one built like this. You expecting a siege?" "Something like that," Clara replied. She paid him from the dwindling reserves of her inheritance and spent the rest of the day organizing her new supplies. Thomas had been thorough. There was flour enough to bake bread for months, beans and salt pork and dried beef, coffee and sugar and salt. There were blankets and candles and lamp oil, medicine and bandages, and a small bottle of laudanum for emergencies. There was even a crate of books, novels and poetry, and a well-worn Bible, as if Thomas had known that the isolation of a long winter could damage the mind as surely as the cold could damage the body. Clara found a note tucked inside the Bible, written in a careful hand that she recognized as Thomas's. "For the dark nights when the fire is not enough, I will return before the solstice." She read the note 3 times, then folded it carefully and tucked it into her pocket, where it stayed for the rest of the day. The weather held through the first week of December, cold but clear, and Clara used the respite to make final preparations. She reinforced her mule shelter with additional straw and earth. She cut more firewood and stacked it in neat rows against her cabin wall. She organized her root cellar with the precision of a quartermaster, preparing for campaign, ensuring that she could find anything she needed, even in complete darkness. She also began receiving visitors. The first was Martha Reeves, who arrived on a grey afternoon with a basket of preserved vegetables and a worried expression. "The Muller family is struggling," Martha said as she warmed herself by Clara's stove. "Their cabin is drafty, and their woodpile is already half gone. The children have been sick with coughs that will not clear. Clara poured coffee for them both. What can be done? Martha shook her head slowly. Not much. Unless they are willing to accept help. And you know how people in this valley are about accepting help. Clara did know. The settlers of Ridgeback Creek were proud people, hardened by years of struggle against a land that offered no quarter. They would rather freeze in their own homes than admit they needed assistance from a neighbor. What about the Dawsons? Clara asked. They have the largest spread in the valley. Surely they could offer some support. Martha's expression darkened. Ezra Dawson does not offer support, she said. He offers loans, and his terms are designed to ensure that struggling families end up owing him more than they can ever repay. Half the homesteads in this valley are already mortgaged to him. Clara absorbed this information in silence. She had suspected that Ezra Dawson's prosperity came at the expense of others, but hearing it confirmed stirred something cold and angry in her chest. If things get bad, Clara said carefully, people are welcome here. I have supplies enough for more than myself. Martha looked at her with an expression that mingled gratitude and concern. You are a good woman, Clara Hensley, but be careful. This valley has a long memory, and not everyone appreciates charity from an outsider. The second visitor came 2 days later, and he was not someone Clara had expected. Jacob Dawson rode up to her cabin in the late afternoon, his horse steaming in the cold air, and dismounted with the stiff movements of a man who had been riding hard. He removed his hat as Clara opened her door, a gesture of respect that surprised her. Mrs. Hensley, he said, I wonder if I might have a word. Clara studied him for a moment, this eldest son of the man who had mocked her and offered to buy her claim with thinly veiled condescension. Jacob was perhaps 30, with his father's broad shoulders but none of his father's arrogance. There was something troubled in his eyes, a worry that seemed at odds with his family's reputation for confidence. Come in, Clara said. They sat by the stove and Clara poured coffee while Jacob gathered his thoughts. He held the tin cup in both hands, staring into the dark liquid as if searching for words. I came to apologize, he said finally, for my father, for what he said to you when you first arrived. Clara raised an eyebrow. Your father can apologize for himself. Jacob shook his head. No, he cannot. That is the problem. My father has never apologized for anything in his life, and he is not about to start now, but I can apologize for standing beside him while he treated you poorly. Clara considered this for a long moment. Why now, she asked. Why come to me after all these weeks? Jacob looked up from his coffee, and the worry in his eyes had deepened into something closer to fear. Because the old men in town are saying this winter will be the worst in 30 years. Because the Hendricks roof collapsed, and the Mueller children are sick, and 3 families have already lost livestock to the cold. And because I rode past your cabin yesterday and realized that you might be the only person in this valley who actually prepared for what is coming. Clara felt a strange mixture of vindication and dread. The validation she had sought was arriving in the worst possible form. I have supplies, she said. If people need help, they can come to me. Jacob nodded slowly. I thought you might say that. He paused and his jaw tightened. But I need to warn you about something. My father will not accept help from you. His pride will not allow it, and he will try to prevent others from accepting help as well. Why would he do that? Because if you save people when he cannot, it undermines everything he has built. His position in this valley depends on being the one people turn to in times of crisis. If a widow from Minnesota proves to be more capable than the great Ezra Dawson, he will never recover from the humiliation. Clara felt her hands tighten around her coffee cup. So he would rather let people die than admit he was wrong about me. Jacob's silence was answer enough. He left a short while later, and Clara stood in her doorway watching him ride away, her mind churning with implications. She had known that Ezra Dawson disliked her, but she had not realized until now how dangerous that dislike might become. Thomas returned on the 15th of December, as promised, riding in from the north with 2 pack horses loaded with furs and supplies. Clara saw him coming from her window and felt her heart lift in a way that startled her with its intensity. She met him at the edge of her property, and for a moment they simply stood looking at each other. the cold air between them filled with things neither of them quite knew how to say. "You kept your promise," Clara said finally. Thomas smiled, that rare expression that transformed his face. "I always keep my promises." They unloaded his supplies together, working in companionable silence, and Clara realized with a start that this was the first time she had not felt alone since arriving in Montana territory. There had been visitors and conversations, and even the beginnings of friendship with Martha Reeves, but none of that had touched the deep isolation that had settled into her bones. With Thomas somehow, that isolation seemed to lift. That evening, they sat by her stove and talked for hours. Thomas told her about his travels through the Blackfoot camps, about the families he had traded with, and the stories the elders had shared. He told her about his mother, who had died when he was 12, and his father, a French-Canadian trapper, who had disappeared into the wilderness when Thomas was still a boy. He told her about the years he had spent learning to survive in a world that did not want him, neither fully accepted by his mother's people, nor welcomed by his father's. Clara listened, and when he finished, she told him her own story. She told him about William and the dreams they had shared, about the consumption that had stolen him away, about the decision she had made to come to Montana territory and claim the life he had wanted for them both. She told him about her father and the lessons he had taught her, about the Norwegian immigrants' stubborn determination to build something that would last. "We are alike," Thomas said when she finished, "both of us building lives in places where we do not quite belong." Clara looked at him across the firelight, and she felt something shift inside her, some wall she had built without realizing it beginning to crumble. "Maybe that is why we understand each other," she said. Thomas held her gaze, and the air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibility. Then he looked away, and the moment passed. "I should make camp outside," he said. "It would not be proper for me to stay under your roof." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that propriety meant nothing in the face of what was coming, but she understood his caution. The settlers of Ridgeback Creek already viewed her with suspicion. If word spread that she was sheltering a Métis man in her cabin, what little tolerance they showed her would evaporate entirely. "There is a lean-to beside the mule shelter," she said. "It is crude, but it will keep the wind off." Thomas nodded. "That will do." He stayed for 3 days, helping Clara with final preparations and riding into town to gather information about conditions across the valley. What he learned was not encouraging. 2 more families had lost livestock. The Hendricks, still staying with the Muellers, were running through their host's supplies at an alarming rate. And Ezra Dawson had begun calling in debts, demanding payment from homesteaders who had borrowed from him during better times. "He is circling," Thomas said grimly, "like a wolf waiting for the weak ones to fall. Can he be stopped?" Thomas shook his head. "Not by us. The law is on his side. The debts are real. And the contracts are binding." Clara felt a surge of helpless anger. "So we just watch while he picks apart what is left of this community." "We do what we can for those who will accept our help," Thomas said, "and we survive. That is all anyone can do." On the morning Thomas was scheduled to leave, the temperature dropped sharply. Clara woke to find the world outside her cabin transformed into a landscape of blue shadows and crystalline frost, so cold that the air itself seemed to crackle with each breath. Her water bucket had frozen solid, despite being only 3 feet from the stove. Thomas appeared at her door with ice in his beard and a troubled expression. "I cannot leave today," he said. "The passes will be impassable. The cold is too intense even for the horses." Clara felt a mixture of relief and fear. Relief that he would be staying, fear at what this new intensity of cold might mean. "Come inside," she said. "We will wait it out together." They spent that day huddled by the stove, feeding it wood at twice the normal rate just to maintain a survivable temperature. Thomas explained that this was what the Blackfoot called the White Death, a cold so extreme that it could kill a man in minutes if he was caught unprepared. He had seen it only twice before in his life, and both times people had died. The cold held for 3 days. On the second day, Clara saw smoke rising from the direction of the Dawson spread and knew that even their large cabin was struggling against the freeze. On the third day, the smoke from the Muller homestead went out entirely. "They are burning furniture," Thomas said grimly. "They have run out of wood." Clara felt sick. We have to help them. In this cold, we would die before we reached them, and they would not accept help from us anyway. She wanted to argue, wanted to insist that human decency demanded action, but she knew he was right. The cold was a wall around them, impenetrable and indifferent. Anyone who ventured out would not survive long enough to help anyone else. On the fourth day, the temperature rose slightly, just enough to make travel possible. Thomas prepared to leave immediately, but before he could mount his horse, a figure appeared on the trail leading to Clara's property. It was Maggie Dawson, Ezra's 17-year-old daughter. She was stumbling through the snow, her face white with cold and her clothing inadequate for the conditions. Clara ran to meet her, wrapping her own coat around the girl's shaking shoulders and helping her toward the cabin. "Please," Maggie gasped, her voice barely audible. "Please help. Our cabin is collapsing. The roof cannot hold the snow." Clara looked at Thomas, and in his eyes, she saw the same grim understanding that filled her own heart. The killing cold had begun, and the reckoning was at hand. Clara half-carried Maggie Dawson into the cabin, the girl's body shaking so violently that her teeth chattered like castanets. Thomas followed close behind, shutting the door against the killing cold and immediately moving to build up the fire. Clara guided Maggie to the warmest spot beside the stove and began stripping off her inadequate clothing, replacing it with blankets and furs. The girl's lips were blue, and her fingers had the waxy pallor that preceded frostbite. Clara worked quickly, rubbing warmth back into the frozen extremities, while Thomas heated water and prepared the herbal remedy the Blackfoot used for cold exposure. "How long were you outside?" Clara demanded. Maggie struggled to form words through her chattering teeth. "An hour, maybe more. The trail was blocked by drifts. I had to climb over them. An hour in that cold should have killed her." Clara looked at Thomas and saw the same thought reflected in his eyes. The girl had survived through sheer determination and perhaps a measure of luck that bordered on miraculous. "Tell me what happened," Clara said, keeping her voice calm despite the urgency pounding in her chest. Maggie's story emerged in fragments between shuddering breaths. The Dawson cabin, built 20 years ago by Ezra's father, had begun groaning under the weight of accumulated snow 2 days earlier. Ezra had dismissed the sounds as settling timber, refusing to acknowledge that his home might be vulnerable. Then that morning a support beam had cracked with a sound like a gunshot, and the north wall had begun to bow inward. "Father sent me for help," Maggie said, and tears began to track down her frost-burned cheeks. "He would not come himself. He said it would be an admission of failure." Clara felt a flash of fury so intense it nearly stole her breath. Ezra Dawson had sent his 17-year-old daughter into killing cold rather than humble himself to ask for assistance. The man's pride was beyond reckless. It was criminal. "How many people are in your cabin?" Clara asked. "My parents," Maggie said. "My brothers Jacob, Samuel, and Peter. Their wives, and the children." She paused, counting silently. 14 in all, including the little ones. Thomas had finished preparing the herbal remedy, and he pressed a warm cup into Maggie's trembling hands. "Drink this," he said. "All of it." While Maggie drank, Clara pulled Thomas aside. "We cannot bring 14 people here," she whispered. "I have supplies, but the cabin cannot hold that many." Thomas's expression was grim. "We may not have a choice. If their cabin collapses, they will die." Clara's mind raced through the logistics. Her cabin was perhaps 20 feet by 16, large by homestead standards, but impossibly small for 16 people. They would be packed together like cattle in a rail car. Food would run short within weeks. Sanitation would become a nightmare. And the tensions between Ezra Dawson and herself would transform every moment into a powder keg waiting for a spark. But Thomas was right. There was no choice. "Can you make it to their cabin?" Clara asked. Thomas nodded slowly. "If I leave now before the cold intensifies again. But I will need the wagon and both mules to transport everyone. Take whatever you need," Clara said. "And Thomas." She gripped his arm, her fingers digging into the leather of his coat. "Be careful." He covered her hand with his own, and for a moment, the chaos and urgency faded into a single point of connection between them. "I will come back," he said, "I promise." Then he was gone, moving with efficient speed to harness the mules and load the wagon with blankets and supplies. Clara watched from the window as he drove away, his figure shrinking against the vastness of the frozen landscape, and she felt fear settle into her bones like a second cold. She turned back to Maggie, who had stopped shaking and was watching Clara with eyes that held a strange mixture of gratitude and shame. "I am sorry," Maggie said, "for what my father said about you, for what we all said." Clara knelt beside her and took the empty cup from her hands. "That does not matter now," she said. "What matters is getting your family to safety." The hours that followed were the longest of Clara's life. She kept the fire burning and the coffee hot, watching the trail for any sign of Thomas's return, while the shadows lengthened and the temperature continued to drop. Maggie slept fitfully on a pallet by the stove, her body recovering from its ordeal, even as her mind remained troubled by dreams that made her cry out and thrash. It was nearly dark when Clara finally saw movement on the trail. Her heart leaped, then sank, as she recognized not the wagon, but a single figure on horseback. For a terrible moment she thought Thomas had failed, that the cold had claimed him and the Dawson family both. Then she realized the rider was Jacob Dawson, and behind him, emerging from the gathering dusk, came the wagon with Thomas at the reins and what seemed like a mountain of blanket-wrapped humanity huddled in the back. Clara ran outside, heedless of the cold, and reached the wagon just as Thomas brought the mules to a stop. His face was grey with exhaustion, and his beard was white with frost, but he managed a weary smile when he saw her. "I brought guests," he said. "The unloading took nearly an hour." The Dawson family members were in various states of cold exposure, from merely chilled to dangerously frozen. Clara directed the healthier ones to carry the weaker into the cabin, while she assessed injuries and prioritized treatment. Ezra Dawson came last, supported by two of his sons, his face a mask of humiliation and barely suppressed rage. He did not look at Clara as he entered her cabin. He did not thank her or acknowledge that she had saved his family from certain death. He simply found a corner, as far from the stove as possible, and sat with his back against the wall, his eyes fixed on some distant point that only he could see. Clara did not have time to deal with his wounded pride. She was too busy treating frostbite, heating broth, and organizing the chaos of 14 additional people crammed into a space designed for one. The first night was a nightmare of logistics and tension. Clara gave up her bed to Ezra's wife, a frail woman named Constance who seemed perpetually terrified of her husband. The children, 5 of them ranging in age from 2 to 12, were arranged on pallets near the stove. The adults took what space remained, sitting or lying in shifts because there was not room for everyone to sleep at once. Thomas stayed outside in the lean-to despite Clara's protests. "It is better this way," he said. "Dawson will not accept help from a half-breed under his own roof. This is his roof now, at least in his mind, and my presence inside would only make things worse." Clara wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. Ezra Dawson had not spoken a single word since entering her cabin, but his silence was more eloquent than any speech. He radiated resentment like a stove radiated heat, and his family walked on eggshells around him, speaking in whispers and avoiding eye contact. The second day brought a temporary break in the cold, and Clara used the respite to establish routines that would make their confinement bearable. She assigned tasks to everyone who was capable of working, from the older children who could tend the fire to the adults who could cook and clean. She established a schedule for meals, for sleeping, for the use of the chamber pot that served as their only sanitary facility. Not everyone cooperated. Ezra Dawson refused to participate in any communal activity, sitting in his corner like a malevolent statue and accepting food and water only from his wife's hands. His sons worked willingly enough, perhaps grateful for any distraction from their father's brooding presence, but his daughters-in-law were nearly as difficult as he was, complaining about the crowded conditions and the quality of the food and the primitive nature of their accommodations. "You should be grateful," Martha Reeves said sharply on the third day, when one of the daughters-in-law whined about the lack of fresh vegetables. She had arrived that morning with a group of other settlers whose cabins had proven inadequate, bringing Clara's total population to 23. "You should be on your knees thanking Mrs. Hensley for taking you in, instead of criticizing her hospitality." The daughter-in-law, a pinch-faced woman named Delilah, who was married to Samuel, flushed red but did not respond. Ezra Dawson looked up from his corner, his eyes narrowing, but he too remained silent. That night Clara stepped outside to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the cabin and found Thomas sitting by a small fire in the lean-to, wrapped in furs and staring at the star-filled sky. "May I join you?" she asked. He shifted to make room, and she sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. The cold was intense but bearable, and after the stuffiness of the cabin it felt almost refreshing. "You have performed a miracle," Thomas said quietly. 23 people in a cabin built for one, and no one has died yet." Clara laughed, though there was little humor in the sound. "The winter is not over. Give it time." They sat in companionable silence for a long moment, watching their breath fog in the starlight. Then Thomas spoke again, his voice soft. "My mother used to say that the true measure of a person is not how they behave when times are easy, but how they behave when times are hard. By that measure, you are one of the finest people I have ever known." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest despite the cold. "And by that same measure, what am I to make of you? A man who rides into killing cold to save people who despise him." Thomas turned to look at her, and in the starlight his eyes were dark pools that seemed to hold depths she could only imagine. "I did not do it for them," he said. "I did it for you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning neither of them was quite ready to address. Clara felt her heart pounding against her ribs, felt the pull of something that had been building between them since their first meeting outside Harold Peck's store. "Thomas," she began. He shook his head slightly. "Not now," he said. "Not while we are in the middle of survival. When this winter ends, if we both live through it, then we can talk about what comes next. But for now, let us just be grateful that we have each other." Clara nodded, though part of her wanted to throw caution aside and speak the words that were crowding her throat. Instead, she leaned against him, letting her head rest on his shoulder, and they sat together in the cold and the starlight until the fire burned low. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of monotonous survival. Clara established a rhythm that kept the cabin functioning, if not thriving. Meals were served twice daily, rationed carefully to stretch the supplies as far as possible. The children were kept occupied with lessons organized by Martha Reeves, who transformed one corner of the cabin into a makeshift schoolroom. The adults worked in shifts to maintain the fire, melt snow for water, and manage the endless small tasks that kept 23 people alive. The cold continued, relentless and merciless. On the worst days, the temperature dropped so low that the water in their buckets froze, despite being only feet from the stove. On those days, everyone huddled together in the center of the cabin, sharing body heat and praying for the weather to break. Clara's double walls proved their worth again and again, maintaining a survivable temperature when any other structure would have become a frozen tomb. Word reached them, through the occasional brave soul who ventured out during breaks in the weather, that the rest of the valley was not faring as well. The Muller family had abandoned their cabin entirely and moved in with the Hendricks, who were themselves barely surviving in a neighbor's barn. 3 homesteads on the far side of the valley had gone silent, and no one dared check on them until the cold relented. Cattle were dying by the hundreds, freezing where they stood, and the losses would devastate the valley's economy for years to come. In Clara's cabin, the human losses were mounting as well, though not in the form of death. Ezra Dawson's pride had curdled into something darker during his confinement, a simmering rage that poisoned every interaction and made his family walk on eggshells around him. He had stopped eating regular meals, accepting only what his wife pressed upon him, and his eyes had taken on a hollow, haunted quality that made Clara deeply uneasy. The breaking point came on the 12th day. Clara had stepped outside to speak with Thomas, leaving Martha Reeves in charge of the cabin. They were discussing the dwindling supply of firewood, which would need to be replenished soon despite the dangerous cold, when a commotion erupted inside. Clara burst through the door to find Ezra Dawson on his feet, his face contorted with rage. His finger pointed at his son, Jacob. "You dare defend her?" Ezra was shouting, his voice cracked and wild. "You dare take the side of this foreign woman against your own father?" Jacob stood his ground, though Clara could see fear in his eyes. "I'm not taking sides, Father. I'm simply saying that we owe Mrs. Hensley our lives and we should show her proper gratitude." Gratitude. Ezra spat the word like a curse. I should be grateful that a widow with foreign ideas has humiliated me in front of the entire valley. I should be grateful that I'm forced to accept charity from a woman I offered to buy out 6 months ago." Clara stepped forward. "Mr. Dawson," she said, keeping her voice calm, "I understand this is difficult for you, but we are all trying to survive here. If you cannot contribute positively, at least refrain from making things harder for everyone else." Ezra turned on her, and the hatred in his eyes made her take an involuntary step backward. "You," he snarled, "you think you have won something. You think that because your ridiculous cabin is still standing, you have proven yourself better than the rest of us." "I think nothing of the kind," Clara said. "I think I prepared for a hard winter, and my preparations proved wise, that is all." Ezra laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. "Your preparations, your Norwegian tricks, and your foreign methods." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a hiss. "I know what you really are. You are a woman alone, with no husband and no family, who has taken up with a half-breed savage. Do you think I do not see him lurking outside? Do you think I do not know what goes on between you?" Clara felt heat flood her face, whether from anger or embarrassment she could not tell. "There is nothing improper between Mr. Crowfeather and myself," she said, "and even if there were, it would be none of your concern." "Everything in this valley is my concern," Ezra said. "I built this community. I held it together when others wanted to give up and leave, and I will not see it destroyed by a woman who does not know her place." He raised his hand, and for a terrible moment, Clara thought he was going to strike her. But before he could move, Thomas was there, having entered silently through the door Clara had left open. He caught Ezra's wrist in an iron grip and twisted, forcing the older man to his knees. "You will not touch her," Thomas said, and his voice was quiet but carried a threat that made even Ezra Dawson go pale. "You will not threaten her. You are a guest in her home, and you will behave accordingly." He released Ezra's wrist and stepped back, and the older man remained on his knees, breathing hard, his face a mask of humiliated fury. The cabin had gone silent. Every eye was fixed on the scene, and Clara could see a mixture of shock, fear, and something that might have been satisfaction on the faces around her. Ezra Dawson, the most powerful man in the valley, had been brought low, and everyone had witnessed it. Jacob stepped forward and helped his father to his feet. "Come, father," he said quietly. "You need rest." He led Ezra back to his corner, and the old man went without resistance, all the fight seemingly drained out of him. His wife Constance followed, wringing her hands and casting apologetic glances at Clara. Thomas moved to stand beside Clara, close enough that his presence was a comfort. "Are you all right?" he asked. Clara nodded, though her hands were shaking. "I am fine," she said. "Thank you." That night, as the cabin settled into uneasy sleep around her, Clara lay awake and stared at the ceiling and wondered what price they would all pay for what had happened. Ezra Dawson was not a man who forgave humiliation, and the winter was far from over. The days following the confrontation with Ezra Dawson were tense but quiet. The old man had retreated into himself, barely speaking even to his wife, his eyes fixed on some distant point that seemed to exist only in his mind. Clara watched him carefully, alert for any sign that his rage might resurface, but he seemed diminished somehow, as if Thomas's intervention had broken something inside him that could not be easily repaired. January ground on with relentless cruelty. The temperature remained far below zero for days at a time, occasionally rising just enough to allow brief ventures outside before plummeting again. Clara organized expeditions to gather more firewood, sending groups of 3 or 4 men to her timber grove with axes and sleds while she stayed behind to manage the cabin. Thomas led most of these expeditions, his knowledge of survival in extreme cold proving invaluable. The supplies Clara had stockpiled were holding, but barely. She reduced rations twice during the 3rd week of January, cutting portions to stretch what remained. No one complained except Delilah, whose whining had become such a constant background noise that most people had learned to ignore it entirely. The children bore the reduced food with a stoicism that broke Clara's heart, their small faces growing thinner and their eyes growing larger as the winter wore on. On the 23rd day of their confinement, a break in the weather allowed Harold Peck to reach Clara's cabin with news from town. He arrived on snowshoes, his face red with exertion and cold, and the information he brought was grim. 3 families on the far side of the valley had perished, he reported, sitting by the stove with his hands wrapped around a cup of hot coffee. The Wilsons, the Tanners, and old man Fredrickson. Found them all frozen in their cabins when the cold let up enough for people to check on them. Clara closed her eyes and said a silent prayer for souls she had never met. How many total? 9 dead that we know of, Harold said. Could be more we have not found yet. The livestock losses are catastrophic. I would estimate 80% of the cattle in the valley are gone, maybe more. This winter will be remembered for generations. He looked around the crowded cabin, taking in the 23 faces that watched him with varying expressions of fear, hope, and exhaustion. You have performed a miracle here, Mrs. Hensley, he said. Everyone in this cabin would be dead if not for you. Clara shook her head. They would be dead if not for my father, who taught me how to build, and they would be dead if not for Thomas Crowfeather, who warned me what was coming and helped me prepare. She glanced toward the door, beyond which Thomas was working to repair a section of the mule shelter that had been damaged by the wind. Harold followed her gaze, and something shifted in his expression. The half-breed, he said, and his voice held a note of grudging respect. I heard he rode into that killing cold to rescue the Dawson family. Takes courage, that does. It takes more than courage, Clara said. It takes a good heart. Something many people in this valley have failed to recognize. Harold nodded slowly, absorbing her words. When this is over, he said, things are going to be different around here. People are going to remember who helped them and who did not. They are going to remember who prepared and who mocked those preparations. Clara said nothing, but she felt a small flame of hope kindle in her chest. Perhaps the suffering of this winter would not be entirely without meaning. Perhaps something good could grow from the ashes of what had been lost. Harold left that afternoon, promising to return with additional supplies if the weather permitted. Clara watched him disappear into the white wilderness and turned back to the endless work of keeping 23 people alive. February arrived with no relief from the cold. The temperature rose slightly, enough that the worst of the killing freeze seemed to have passed, but it remained far below zero and showed no signs of warming further. Clara's supplies were running dangerously low now, and she was forced to implement strict rationing that left everyone hungry and irritable. The cabin had developed its own ecosystem of alliances and tensions. Martha Reeves had become Clara's unofficial second-in-command, managing the children and mediating disputes with a firm hand and a sharp tongue. Jacob Dawson had emerged as the leader of the working parties, organizing the men with an efficiency that surprised Clara given his father's current state. Maggie Dawson, fully recovered from her near-fatal journey through the cold, had attached herself to Clara like a shadow, helping with cooking and cleaning and asking endless questions about Norwegian building techniques. Ezra Dawson remained in his corner, a malevolent presence that cast a pall over even the most mundane activities. He had begun eating again, at his wife's desperate insistence, but he spoke to no one except Constance and refused to participate in any communal activities. His sons avoided him, embarrassed by his behavior, and his daughters-in-law had stopped trying to engage him entirely. The breaking point came on the 15th of February, not with violence but with collapse. Clara woke that morning to find Ezra Dawson lying on the floor beside his pallet, his body rigid and his face contorted in an expression of frozen anguish. For a terrible moment she thought he was dead, but when she knelt beside him, she felt the flutter of his pulse and the shallow rise and fall of his chest. He is breathing, she told Constance, who had awakened to find her husband fallen and was now weeping silently by his side. But something is wrong. His body is rigid, and he will not respond to his name. Thomas, summoned from the lean-to, examined Ezra with careful hands and a troubled expression. I have seen this before, he said quietly. Among the elders in the Blackfoot camps, it is called the frozen spirit. When a man's pride is broken and he cannot accept what has happened to him, sometimes his body follows his spirit into rigidity. Can he recover? Jacob asked. He had pushed through the crowd and now stood looking down at his father with an expression that mingled concern and something that might have been relief. Thomas shook his head slowly. I do not know. The elders I saw with this condition, some recovered and some did not. It depends on whether they can find a reason to return to themselves. They moved Ezra to Clara's bed, the warmest spot in the cabin, and Constance took up a vigil beside him that she would maintain for days. Clara organized the others to give the family privacy, creating a screen of hung blankets that separated the sick room from the rest of the cabin. That night, Jacob Dawson asked to speak with Clara privately. They stepped outside into the bitter cold, their breath fogging in the starlight, and he stood for a long moment in silence before finding the words he needed. "I want to apologize," he said, "not for what my father did, because that is his burden to bear, but for what I did not do. I should have stood up to him years ago. I should have told him that his pride was destroying everything he claimed to want to protect." Clara studied his face in the dim light. "Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to know that when this is over, things are going to change. My father has controlled this valley through fear and debt for too long. If he recovers, I will not let him continue. And if he does not recover, then I will do what I can to repair the damage he has done." Clara felt something ease in her chest, some tension she had been carrying since the day she arrived in Ridgeback Creek. "That is a good start," she said. "But words are easy. Actions are what matter." Jacob nodded. "I know. You have every reason to doubt me. But I swear to you, Mrs. Hensley, on my mother's life, that I will prove myself worthy of your trust." He returned to the cabin, and Clara stood alone in the cold for a long moment, watching the stars wheel overhead and thinking about the strange turns that life could take. The thaw began in late February, so gradually at first that Clara did not trust it. The temperature crept upward degree by painful degree, and the snow began to settle and compact under its own weight. Icicles formed on the eaves of the cabin, dripping in the weak afternoon sun, and the air lost some of its brutal edge. By the first week of March, it was clear that the worst was over. The temperature rose above zero for the first time in months, and people began venturing outside for longer periods. The men organized expeditions to check on abandoned homesteads and assess the damage across the valley. The reports they brought back were devastating. Livestock losses exceeded 90% in some areas. Cabins had collapsed under the weight of snow, barns had burned when desperate families tried to generate heat with inadequate stoves, and the economic foundation of the valley had been shattered. It would take years, perhaps decades, for Ridgeback Creek to recover from what the old-timers were already calling the winter of death. But amid the devastation, there were signs of hope. The families who had sheltered in Clara's cabin began returning to their own properties to assess damage and begin repairs. Some found their homes intact enough to occupy immediately. Others faced the prospect of rebuilding from the ground up. All of them left with gratitude and a changed perspective on the widow from Minnesota who had saved their lives. Ezra Dawson remained in Clara's cabin, still rigid and unresponsive, tended by his faithful wife and visited daily by his sons. Clara gave them space and time, asking nothing in return for her continued hospitality. She understood that some wounds needed to heal in their own way, at their own pace. Thomas had been preparing to leave for the Blackfoot camps when the thaw began, but he delayed his departure day after day, finding reasons to stay that both he and Clara knew were pretexts. They spent long hours talking by the fire, sharing stories and dreams and fears, building the foundation of something that neither of them quite had the courage to name. On a warm afternoon in mid-March, with the snow melting in earnest and the first hints of green appearing on the southern slopes, Clara and Thomas walked together to the ridge above her property. They stood looking out over the valley, which was slowly shaking off its shroud of white, and Thomas took her hand in his. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what comes next." Clara felt her heart quicken. "And what have you concluded?" "That I do not want to leave," he said, "that the life I have been living, trading between camps and settlements, belonging to no one and nowhere, is not the life I want anymore." "What life do you want?" Thomas turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw everything he had been holding back since the day they met. "I want a life with you," he said. "I want to build something together here on this land that you have made your own. I know what people will say. I know the obstacles we will face. But I have spent my whole life being told where I do not belong. I am tired of listening." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, and she did not try to stop them. "I've been alone for so long," she said, even before William died. I was preparing myself for solitude. I thought that was my fate. I thought I would build my cabin and work my land and grow old by myself. And now? Clara smiled through her tears. Now I think fate had other plans. She stepped forward and kissed him, there on the ridge with the valley spread out below them and the spring sun warming their faces. It was not a passionate kiss, not yet, but a promise of passion to come. It was a beginning. They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, and Clara did not care who saw them or what they might say. The recovery of Ridgeback Creek continued through the spring and into the summer. Families rebuilt what had been destroyed, combining resources and labor in ways that would have seemed impossible before the winter of death. The old divisions between settlers, the petty rivalries and simmering resentments, had been burned away by the cold, leaving something cleaner in their place. Clara's cabin became a gathering place for the community, a symbol of preparation and resilience that people visited to remind themselves of what was possible. She welcomed them all, sharing the techniques her father had taught her, helping neighbors reinforce their own cabins against whatever winters might come. Thomas stayed, as he had promised. He built a proper cabin of his own beside Clara's, connected by a covered walkway that allowed them to move between the two structures without braving the elements. They were married in June, in a ceremony officiated by a circuit preacher and attended by nearly everyone in the valley. Martha Reeves stood as Clara's witness, and Jacob Dawson, now the effective head of his family, stood as Thomas's. Ezra Dawson recovered slowly, regaining movement and speech over the course of months. When he finally emerged from Clara's cabin in late April, he was a changed man, diminished in body and spirit. He never apologized for his behavior, but he also never spoke against Clara or Thomas again. He retreated to what remained of his ranch and let his sons take over the management of his affairs. Jacob Dawson proved true to his word. He forgave the debts his father had accumulated, returning land and property to families who had been on the verge of losing everything. He worked alongside the other settlers to rebuild what had been lost, leading by example rather than intimidation. The valley began to heal under his quiet leadership. Maggie Dawson visited Clara often, learning everything she could about construction and survival and the thousand small skills that made the difference between thriving and merely surviving. She spoke of someday building her own homestead, and Clara encouraged her dreams while teaching her the practical knowledge to achieve them. As the first anniversary of the winter of death approached, Clara stood on the ridge above her property with Thomas beside her and looked out over the valley that had become her home. The land was green with summer growth, and cattle grazed on pastures that had been empty and frozen a year before. The scars of that terrible winter were still visible, in the gaps where cabins had once stood and the crosses that marked new graves in the cemetery. But life was returning, stubborn and persistent, pushing up through the ashes of what had been lost. "They laughed at me," Clara said quietly. "When I first arrived, they thought I was a fool with foreign ideas." Thomas put his arm around her shoulders. "And now? Now they know better." Clara leaned into him, drawing comfort from his warmth and his presence. "But the truth is, I did not do it to prove them wrong. I did it because I wanted to live. I did it because my father taught me that survival is not about pride or proving yourself to others. It is about preparing for the worst and hoping for the best. And what do you hope for now?" Clara turned to look at him, this man who had appeared in her life when she needed him most and had stayed when she needed him still. "I hope for many things," she said. "A good harvest, healthy animals, children someday if we are blessed. But mostly I hope for more days like this one, more moments of peace after the storm." Thomas kissed her forehead gently. "That is a good hope," he said, "and one I share." They stood together on the ridge as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The valley spread out below them, scarred but surviving, broken but rebuilding. And in the cabin that Clara had built with her own hands, the cabin that had withstood the worst winter in 30 years, a fire burned steady and warm, ready to welcome them home. The neighbors had laughed at the homesteader when she arrived with her strange ideas and her foreign methods. But when the killing cold came and the temperature dropped to 50 below and the world turned white and silent with death, it was her cabin that stood firm. It was her preparation that saved them, and it was her stubborn Norwegian-bred determination that proved once and for all that the best way to survive in hard country was not to fear the worst, but to build for it. Clara Hensley had come to Montana Territory as a widow, with nothing but a claim and a dream. She had faced mockery and isolation and the worst winter in living memory. And she had emerged on the other side with a home, a husband, and a community that would never forget what she had done for them. Some stories end with triumph and celebration. This one ended with something quieter, but no less valuable. It ended with a woman standing on a ridge at sunset, looking out over a valley she had helped save, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them the same way she had faced the winter of death, with preparation, with perseverance, and with the stubborn refusal to let anyone tell her what she could not do.